They used to call me a freeloader and wouldn't even let me sit at the family table. Now they're begging me to save their home from the bank. Yeah, I know how that sounds. Like some revenge fantasy you'd read on one of those drama subreddits. But stick with me here, because this mess took years to unfold, and honestly, I'm still processing how it all went down. My name's Alex, and growing up, my family didn't even pretend we were all loved equally. My older sister Jenny was a smart one, straight A's, debate team, the whole 9 yards. My brother Sam was the athletic golden boy, varsity football, scholarship offers, dad's pride and joy. And me? I was just the third kid, the afterthought, the oops baby who showed up 5 years after Sam when my parents thought they were done. They literally called me number 3. Not as a joke. That was my actual nickname around the house. Mom would yell up the stairs for dinner, and it'd be Sam, Jenny, and number 3. Dad would introduce us to neighbors as, "These are my kids. Sam plays quarterback. Jenny's headed to state university. And this is our third one." I wish I was exaggerating, but the evidence was everywhere. Family photos hanging in our hallway. There I am, standing awkwardly to the side while my siblings flanked my parents in the center. Christmas morning, Sam and Jenny got wrapped presents under the tree. Mine came in gift bags, usually stuff Mom grabbed last minute from the grocery store. You know those checkout line impulse buys? Yeah, that was my Christmas haul. But the dinner table thing, that's what really got to me. Our dining room had this nice wooden table that sat 6 people comfortably. During regular meals, we'd all squeeze in somehow. But for holidays, special occasions, or when we had guests, they'd set exactly 4 places. Mom, Dad, Sam, and Jenny got the real chairs. I got stuck on this wobbly kitchen stool pushed into the corner, eating off a TV tray. One Thanksgiving, I was maybe 12, I finally asked why I couldn't sit with everyone else. Dad didn't even look up from carving the turkey when he said it wasn't a sympathy contest. Only people who amounted to something got seats at the grown-up table. Mom just laughed and said I'd understand when I was older. My siblings? They acted like I wasn't even there. The birthday thing was worse, though. Sam's 10th birthday party was this huge backyard barbecue with a bounce house and everything. Jenny got a sweet 16 with catering and a DJ. When my 10th rolled around, Mom baked a sheet cake from a box mix, and we ate in the kitchen. No candles, no decorations, no friends invited. When I looked disappointed, they just said I was being dramatic and should be grateful for what I got. But here's the thing that really messed with my head. I kept trying to earn their approval. Need someone to clean the garage? I volunteered. Car needs washing? I'd spend my Saturdays scrubbing it until it sparkled. Jenny needed a ride somewhere, and Mom was busy? I'd bike across town to walk her home. I genuinely believed that if I just worked hard enough, proved myself useful enough, they'd finally see me as part of the family. High school was more the same. Sam's football games were mandatory family events. We'd all pile into Dad's truck wearing his jersey number. Jenny's debate competitions turned into weekend road trips with hotel stays and fancy dinners. My track meets, I'd scan the stands looking for familiar faces and come up empty every single time. Senior year was when it really hit me how little I mattered to them. College application season rolled around, and while Jenny had gotten help with essays and campus visits, I was completely on my own. When I asked Dad about FAFSA forms, he handed me a stack of papers and told me to figure out myself. I ended up at the local community college because it was all I could afford. But graduation day, that's when I knew for sure where I stood. I'd worked my tail off to finish in the top 10% of my class despite having zero support at home. I was actually excited for once, thinking maybe this would be the moment they'd finally be proud of me. I put on my cap and gown, double-checked the ceremony time, and waited for them to get ready. They never showed up, not one of them. I stood there after the ceremony ended, watching families take pictures and celebrate together, completely alone in my graduation outfit. Other parents were asking where my family was, and I just made up excuses about them being busy with work. That night, I got a text from Dad that made my stomach drop. No apology, no explanation, just 8 words that basically summed up my entire childhood. We were busy. don't take it personally. Like missing your kid's high school graduation was the same as forgetting to pick up milk from the store. That's when I started making plans to disappear. Not dramatically or anything. I just quietly started researching how to get as far away as possible with the money I'd saved from my part-time job at the hardware store. I remember my grandpa on Dad's side lived somewhere out in Idaho. Dad never talked about him except to say he'd abandoned the family years ago. But I figured anyone my parents didn't like couldn't be all bad. 3 weeks after graduation, I bought a one-way Greyhound ticket to Boise. I left a note on my pillow saying I was going to find work and would call when I got settled. Looking back, I'm not sure they even noticed I was gone until the electric bill came, and they realized they'd lost their designated errand boy and household maintenance crew. But that bus ride to Idaho? That's where this whole crazy story really begins. That Greyhound ride to Idaho was the longest 26 hours of my life. Not because of the uncomfortable seats or the weird smell coming from the bathroom, but because I had absolutely no idea what I was walking into. All I had was an address I'd found in Mom's old address book and a phone number that might not even work anymore. My grandfather's name was Frank, and according to a few stories I'd pieced together over the years, he'd left Ohio when Dad was in high school. Something about a big fight with my grandmother before she passed away. Dad always made him sound like some deadbeat who couldn't handle responsibility. But honestly, knowing my dad's version of events, I figured there had to be another side to that story. The bus dropped me off in this tiny town called Meridian, just outside Boise. Picture the most middle-of-nowhere place you can imagine, one main street, a diner that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s, and more pickup trucks than I'd ever seen in one place. I felt like I'd stepped into a Western movie, except instead of tumbleweeds, there were just a lot of confused looks from locals wondering what some scrawny kid with a duffel bag was doing wandering around their town. I spent my first night in a motel that charged by the hour and smelled like cigarettes and regret. The next morning, I worked up the courage to call the number I'd found. It rang 4 times before this gruff voice answered with a simple yeah. I stumbled through an explanation of who I was, expecting him to hang up or tell me to get lost. Instead, there was this long pause. Then he said to meet him at something called Frank's Auto Repair on Main Street. Walking up to that shop was terrifying. The building was this converted gas station with bay doors wide open. Country music blasting from a radio covered in grease stains. I could see someone underneath a beat-up Ford Explorer. Tools scattered everywhere. Work boots sticking out from under the chassis. I cleared my throat and said I was looking for Frank. The boot stopped moving. Then this older guy rolled out from under the car on one of those mechanics creepers. He was nothing like what I'd expected. Sure, he was covered in motor oil and wearing the most beat-up work clothes I'd ever seen, but his eyes were sharp and kind. He looked me up and down for a solid 30 seconds, then wiped his hands on a rag and extended one toward me. When he shook my hand, his grip was firm but not trying to prove anything, just a handshake of someone who worked with his hands for a living. Instead of some emotional reunion scene, he just asked if I was hungry and nodded toward the diner across the street. Over coffee and the greasiest burger I'd ever eaten, I told him the whole story. About being number 3, about graduation day, about finally having enough of being treated like furniture in my own house. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow, but mostly just letting me talk. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me something that completely changed how I saw my dad. Turns out, Frank hadn't abandoned anyone. My grandmother had been sick for years, and Frank had spent every dime there trying to get her the best treatment possible. When she died, he was broke, and my dad, who was already married to Mom by then, basically told him he was a failure and an embarrassment to the family. Frank left Ohio because staying would have meant watching his son treat him like garbage every day. That afternoon, Frank showed me around the shop. It wasn't much to look at 2 bays, equipment that belonged in a museum, and a customer waiting area that consisted of 3 folding chairs and a coffee pot that looked like it might explode. But Frank knew every bolt and wire in that place. He'd built a business from nothing after arriving in Idaho with literally just the clothes on his back and a toolbox. He offered me a deal that night over dinner at his house, a tiny 2-bedroom place behind the shop. I could stay in the spare room if I helped around the garage and maybe learn the business. No pressure, No timeline, just a chance to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. For the first time in 18 years, someone was offering me a real opportunity instead of just tolerating my existence. The work was hard. I started as basically a glorified shop assistant, organizing tools, cleaning parts, running errands. But Frank was a natural teacher. He'd explain what he was doing while he worked, show me how different systems connected. Let me try things myself even when I messed up. Within a few months, I could diagnose basic problems and handle routine maintenance on my own. But the real education was watching Frank interact with customers. This was small-town Idaho, where your reputation meant everything. Frank never oversold anyone or pushed unnecessary repairs. If someone couldn't afford to fix their car right, he'd find creative solutions or work out payment plans. He treated everyone, from the rancher with a brand new F-250 to the single mom with the 15-year-old Honda, with the same respect and honesty. About 6 months in, Frank started talking about expanding. The shop was busy enough that we were turning away customers, and he'd been thinking about adding a second bay or maybe even opening another location. But he was getting older, and big changes felt overwhelming. That's when I suggested that we start small, maybe update the computer system, create a real website, get some social media presence going. Frank looked at me like I'd suggested we start offering oil changes on Mars. But I showed him how other small businesses were using technology to grow, and slowly he warmed up to the idea. We spent evenings after work building a website, setting up online appointment booking, even creating a Facebook page where customers could see before and after photos of restoration jobs. The results were immediate. Instead of relying on word of mouth and foot traffic, we were getting calls from people 2 towns over who'd found us online. Frank started trusting me with bigger decisions, with supplies to order, how to price jobs, even handling some of the business banking. For the first time in my life, someone believed I was capable of real responsibility. 2 years later, we opened that second location. Frank officially made me a partner and put my name on the business license. Frank and Alex Auto Repair might not sound like much, but seeing my name on those signs felt better than any graduation ceremony or birthday party ever could have. I was 20 years old and co-owner of a growing business with a man who became more of a father to me than my actual dad ever was. But life has this way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. One morning, I showed up to work and found Frank sitting in the office looking pale and shaky. He'd been having chest pains all night, but didn't want to worry me. The ambulance ride to the hospital was the longest 20 minutes of my life, and sitting in that waiting room, I realized Frank was the only real family I'd ever had. The heart attack wasn't massive, but it was serious enough that Frank's doctor said he needed to slow down significantly. Less stress, regular hours, no more crawling under cars or lifting heavy parts. Basically, everything that made Frank happy was now off limits. As we drove home from the hospital, he was quiet for a long time before telling me he'd been thinking about retirement anyway, and maybe this was the universe's way of making the decision for him. That's when he dropped the bombshell that would change everything. He'd already talked to his lawyer about transferring full ownership of both shops to me. All the paperwork was ready. I just needed a sign. At 22, I go from being the family disappointment to owning a successful business that was pulling in 6 figures a year. But Frank's next words are what really got to me. He said I was the son he'd always hoped for, and he couldn't think of anyone better to carry on what he'd built. 3 weeks later, Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was packed with customers, suppliers, and people from all over the county who'd been touched by his kindness and honesty over the years. I gave a eulogy and tried to explain what Frank had meant to me, but words felt inadequate for describing someone who literally saved my life just by treating me like I mattered. And that's when my dad showed up, not to pay respects or offer condolences, but to corner me in the parking lot after the service and ask what Frank had left me in his will. I stared at him for a long moment, realizing this was the first time I'd seen any of my family in over 3 years, and the only reason he'd made the trip was because he thought there might be money involved. Some things never change. 3 years after Frank's funeral, I had expanded to 4 locations across southern Idaho. What started as a 2-bay garage had become a legitimate small business empire. Frank and Alex Auto Repair was now the go-to place for everything from oil changes to full engine rebuilds in 3 counties. I'd hired 12 full-time mechanics, had a dedicated office manager handling the books, and was even getting calls from insurance companies wanting to partner with us for accident repairs. The success wasn't just about the money, though the money was definitely nice. It was about building something real, something that mattered to people. We become the place folks trusted with their most important possession after their house, their vehicle. In rural Idaho, your truck isn't just transportation, it's your livelihood. When a rancher's F-350 breaks down during calving season, or when a working mom's minivan starts making weird noises on her way to work, they call us because they know we'll take care of them. But the media attention did something unexpected. It got me invited to participate in a program supporting veteran-owned small businesses. Even though I wasn't a veteran myself, they wanted businesses like mine to donate services and equipment to help former military members start their own shops. It felt amazing to give back, and honestly, working with some of those veterans reminded me of Frank. Same no-nonsense attitude, same dedication to doing things the right way. The program culminated in this big award ceremony in Boise, where they were recognizing businesses that had made significant contributions to veteran entrepreneurship. I wore my best suit, the first real suit I'd ever owned, and drove the 3 hours to the state capitol feeling proud of what we'd accomplished. The governor was there, local politicians, business leaders from across the state. For a kid who used to eat Thanksgiving dinner on a TV tray, it was pretty surreal. That's where I ran into Jenny. I was grabbing coffee during a break between speakers when I heard someone say my name. I turned around, and there she was, my sister, wearing scrubs and looking genuinely shocked to see me. Turns out she was working as a receptionist at a dermatology clinic in Boise, a far cry from the university track everyone had expected her to follow. We made awkward small talk for a few minutes, and I could see her try to process how her former number 3 brother had ended up at a state business event while she was checking in patients for Botox appointments. She asked for my business card. Apparently, she'd Googled me after seeing my name in the program and couldn't believe what she'd found. For successful locations, dozens of employees featured in business publications. It was like she was meeting a completely different person than the kid she'd grown up ignoring. Before we parted ways, she asked if we could get coffee sometime and catch up properly. I gave her my card, but honestly wasn't sure I'd ever hear from her again. I was wrong. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was my dad, and hearing his voice after almost 4 years was like getting punched in the stomach. He was using that fake friendly tone I remembered from when he wanted something, asking how I was doing, and saying he'd heard I was doing well for myself. The conversation felt like dancing around landmines, both of us being overly polite, while avoiding any mention of why I'd left home in the first place. Finally, he got to the point. They were having some financial difficulties. Nothing too serious, just some temporary cash flow issues, and wondered if I might be able to help out family. The house needed some repairs. There were some medical bills from when Mom had her gallbladder surgery, and Sam's business wasn't doing as well as expected. Just family helping family through a rough patch. I agreed to drive down the following weekend to assess the situation, not because I was eager to reconnect, but because I was curious to see how much had changed and honestly wanted to face my past from a position of strength instead of running away from it. This time, I wouldn't be the desperate kid grateful for scraps of attention. I'd be the successful business owner evaluating whether to extend financial assistance to people who treated me like garbage. The drive back to my hometown was weird. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, more run down. The mall where I'd worked at the hardware store was half empty, with a bunch of storefronts covered in for lease signs. Main Street had that depressing look of a place that had been slowly dying for years, but was too stubborn to admit it. It reminded me why I'd been so eager to leave in the first place. Pulling into my childhood driveway felt like stepping into a time machine, except everything was shabbier than my memories. The house needed painting. The lawn was patchy, and Dad's truck looked like it hadn't been washed in months. But walking up to that front door, I wasn't the same person who'd left through it 4 years earlier. I was older, financially secure, and most importantly, I finally knew what it felt like to be valued and respected. Mom answered the door, and for a second, I saw a genuine surprise cross her face before she composed herself. She looked older, more tired, and was trying too hard to be welcoming. The house felt smaller too, but also somehow emptier. Sam's football trophies were still on the mantel. Jenny's academic awards still covered the refrigerator. But there were no new additions. Just the same shrine to my siblings' high school achievements, now looking dated and sad. Dad appeared in the kitchen doorway, and I was struck by how much he'd aged. His hair had gone completely gray, and he put on weight in that way middle-aged men do when they've given up on staying in shape. But his handshake was still firm, and he was still trying to project that same authority he'd wielded when I was a kid. The difference was I wasn't a kid anymore, and his approval wasn't something I needed or wanted. We sat in the living room, the same room where I'd spent countless evenings being ignored while my siblings got help with homework or talked about their days. Mom brought out coffee and store-bought cookies, treating me like a guest instead of son, which honestly felt more comfortable than pretending we were a normal family catching up. They laid out their financial situation with the kind of detail that told me they'd rehearsed this conversation. The house had a second mortgage they'd taken out to help Sam start his landscaping business, which had failed after 2 seasons. Mom's medical bills were higher than expected because their insurance had changed. Dad's hours at the plant had been cut, and at his age, finding comparable work wasn't realistic. They needed about $40,000 to get back on stable ground. What struck me wasn't the amount. That was actually less than I'd expected. But how they presented it. Everything was framed as temporary setbacks and bad luck, with no acknowledgement of the poor decisions that had led to their situation. Sam's business had failed because he'd had no experience and no business plan. Just Dad's belief that athletic success automatically translated to entrepreneurial success. The medical bills were high because they'd chosen the cheapest insurance plan without understanding the deductibles. It was the same pattern of avoiding responsibility I remember from childhood. But here's the thing that really got to me. Sitting there listening to them ask for help, I realized I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no desire for revenge. They were just 3 people who'd made bad choices and were now facing the consequences. The emotional power they used to have over me was completely gone. I told them I'd think about it and get back to them. As I was leaving, Mom walked me in my truck and made this comment about how proud they were of how well I'd done for myself. It felt like too little too late, but I just thanked her and said I'd be in touch soon. Driving back to Idaho that night, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Not because I wanted to hurt them or help them, but because I finally had the power to set the terms of our relationship. For the first time in my life, they needed something from me more than I needed anything from them. I called my lawyer the Monday after visiting my parents, not because I was angry or looking for payback, but because this was a business decision that needed to be handled professionally. If I was going to help them, it needed to be on terms that protected everyone involved and set clear boundaries about our future relationship. My attorney, Sarah, had been handling all my business legal work since Frank passed away. She was this no-nonsense woman in her 50s who built her practice representing small businesses and farmers across southern Idaho. When I explained the situation, she immediately understood what I was dealing with. She'd seen plenty of family businesses torn apart by money disputes and knew how to structure agreements that protected all parties. The solution we came up with was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of just handing over $40,000 and hoping for the best, I would purchase their house through my business LLC, then lease it back to them at below-market rent for as long as they want to stay. This would give them the cash they needed to pay off their debts, eliminate their mortgage payments, and provide them with stable housing. But it would also mean the property would be mine, with all the legal protections that entailed. Sarah drafted a comprehensive lease agreement that covered everything from maintenance responsibilities to what would happen if they wanted to move or if they violated the terms. It was fair but firm. They had security and stability, but they'd also be accountable tenants rather than homeowners who could make poor financial decisions with impunity. When I called to present the offer, the silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Dad was clearly processing what this meant, that his youngest son, the family disappointment, would now legally own the house he'd lived in for 25 years. When he finally responded, his voice had that edge I remember from childhood, asking if this was some kind of power trip. I explained the business reasoning calmly and professionally. This structure protected both parties, gave them immediate debt relief, and ensured they could stay in their home indefinitely as long as they met their obligations as tenants. If they preferred a different arrangement, they were welcome to explore other options, but this was what I was willing to offer. The next few days were tense. Jenny called to ask what I was trying to prove, suggesting I was being vindictive and using their desperation against them. Sam left a voicemail that was mostly incoherent rambling about family loyalty and how I was disrespecting our parents in their time of need. Mom sent a text saying she was disappointed in how cold I'd become. But here's what none of them seemed to understand. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point. This was about establishing a relationship based on mutual respect and clear expectations instead of the dysfunction that had defined our family for decades. I wasn't asking them to grovel or apologize for the past. I was offering a practical solution to their current problem while protecting my own interests. Finally, Dad called back. The conversation was strained, but he agreed to the terms. The closing was scheduled for the following month, and Sarah handled all the paperwork. When we met at the title company to sign documents, the atmosphere was surreal. Here I was, 25 years old, purchasing my child at home while my parents sat across the table looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. But something interesting happened during that closing. The title agent, who'd been handling real estate transactions in that county for 30 years, recognized my name from the recent business articles. She started asking about my auto repair shops and mentioned she'd heard great things about our work from friends in Idaho. For the first time ever, I watched my parents learn about my success from a stranger who was genuinely impressed by what I'd accomplished. The weeks following the closing were awkward but peaceful. My parents had their debt relief. I had a solid real estate investment, and everyone knew exactly where they stood. I didn't expect gratitude, and I didn't get any. But I also didn't get any more desperate phone calls or guilt trips about family obligations. Then the local newspaper got wind of the story. Not the family drama part, thankfully, but the business success angle. They wanted to do a feature on young entrepreneurs who were making an impact in their hometowns, even from a distance. The article mentioned how I'd grown up locally before building a successful business in Idaho, and how I was now investing back in the community. That article changed everything. Suddenly, people around town knew who I was and what I'd achieved. The hardware store where I'd worked in high school reached out about partnering on tool supplies. The local community college asked if I'd be interested in guest lecturing in their automotive program. Even the mayor's office called about serving on an economic development committee. My siblings' reactions to this newfound local recognition were predictably petty. Jenny made snide comments on social media about people who bought their way into respectability. Sam told anyone who'd listened that I'd gotten lucky with inheritance money from our grandfather, conveniently ignoring the fact that I'd built my business through years of hard work and smart decisions. But the real drama started when a regional business magazine decided to do a larger feature story about successful young entrepreneurs across the Mountain West. The reporter wanted to include background about my family and upbringing, focusing on how I'd overcome early challenges to achieve success. This was supposed to be a positive story about resilience and determination. The interview went well, I thought. I talked about Frank's mentorship, the challenges of growing a business in rural areas, and the importance of treating customers and employees with respect. I mentioned growing up in a household where academic and athletic achievement were highly valued, which had motivated me to find my own path to success. I tried to keep things diplomatic and focus on the business aspects rather than personal family drama. But when the article came out 2 months later, the headline made my stomach drop. From family outcast to business success, how one man turned rejection into million-dollar motivation. The reporter had clearly done additional research, talking to people around my hometown who remember how I'd been treated growing up, former teachers, neighbors. Even some of my high school classmates had shared observations about the family dynamics they'd witnessed. The article wasn't mean-spirited, but it was honest about the challenges I'd faced. It mentioned being excluded from family activities, having to finance my own education, and ultimately leaving home to find opportunities elsewhere. It painted a picture of someone who'd succeeded despite their circumstances rather than because of them, which was accurate but also incredibly embarrassing for my parents. Within hours of the article being published online, my phone started buzzing with calls and texts. Some were congratulatory messages from business contacts and friends who'd read the story. Others were from extended family members and old acquaintances who wanted to reconnect now that I was getting positive media attention. But the call that really mattered came that evening. It was my mother, and for the first time in my memory, she sounded genuinely emotional rather than just going through the motions of maternal concern. She said they'd read the article and wanted to talk to me in person, not about money or business arrangements, but about the past and how things had gotten so twisted in our family. I agreed to drive down that weekend, curious to see if this media attention had actually prompted some genuine self-reflection, or if this was just another attempt to manage their public image. Either way, I figured it was time to have a conversation we should have had years ago. That weekend drive back home felt different than all the previous ones. This time, I wasn't the desperate kid seeking approval, the curious young man assessing a business opportunity, or even the successful entrepreneur setting terms. This time, I was just someone willing to have an honest conversation about our shared history, whatever that might lead to. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed they'd actually made an effort with the house's appearance. The lawn was trimmed. Someone had pressure washed the front walkway, and there were even some flowers planted by the entrance. Small changes, but they suggested this conversation mattered to them more than they'd let on during our phone call. Mom met me at the door, and I could immediately tell she'd been crying recently. Not the manipulative tears I remember from childhood arguments, but the kind of genuine emotion that comes from being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about yourself. Dad was waiting in the living room, looking older and more deflated than I'd ever seen him. Sam and Jenny were there too, which surprised me since I hadn't expected this to be a full family affair. We sat in that same living room where so many awkward conversations had taken place over the years, but the dynamic was completely different now. Instead of me being the outsider looking in, I was the one everyone else was trying to figure out how to approach. The power balance had shifted so dramatically that even the physical space felt different. Dad was the first to speak, and his voice was quiet in a way I'd never heard before. He said reading that article had forced him to see our family history through my eyes, and he was ashamed of how they'd treated me. Not just the big moments like missing my graduation, but the daily dismissiveness that had communicated I was somehow less valuable than my siblings. Mom talked about how she convinced herself at the time that I was just more independent than Sam and Jenny, that I didn't need the same level of attention and support they required. She admitted now that was just a convenient rationalization that let her focus on the children who demanded more of her time and energy. The truth was, she'd taken a path of least resistance and assumed I'd figure things out on my own. Jenny and Sam's apologies were harder to listen to, honestly. They talked about sibling rivalry and not understanding the impact of their behavior. But it was clear they still saw me as someone who'd gotten lucky rather than someone who'd worked to overcome the obstacles our family had created. Their presence felt more like damage control than genuine remorse. But here's the thing that really got to me. Throughout this entire conversation, we were all sitting in the living room. The dining room was right there, with that same wooden table where I'd been excluded from so many family meals and important conversations. It felt symbolic of how even this attempt at reconciliation was happening on their terms, in the space where they felt comfortable rather than addressing the specific ways they'd made me feel unwelcome. When there was a lull in the conversation, I stood up and walked into the dining room. The table looked exactly the same, still set for 4 people, just like it had been during my childhood. I counted the chairs again, even though I knew there were only 4. Then I called back to the living room and asked if we could continue our conversation in here, around the family table. The silence was deafening. Everyone knew what I was asking for, and everyone understood the significance. This wasn't about furniture arrangement. This was about whether they were willing to literally make space for me in the family dynamic that had excluded me for so long. One by one, they filed into the dining room. Mom went to the kitchen and brought back a 5th chair from the breakfast nook, the same wobbly stool I'd been relegated to as a kid, which made me laugh despite the seriousness of the moment. But then Dad disappeared upstairs and came back with the desk chair from their home office, a proper rolling chair that actually matched the height of the table. Sitting around that table as adults, having the conversation we should have had when I was still living under their roof, felt both healing and hollow. The apologies were sincere, and I appreciated finally hearing them acknowledge how their behavior had affected me. But apologies don't undo decades of feeling like an outsider in your own family, and good intentions don't automatically rebuild relationships that were never properly built in the first place. What emerged from that conversation was something like mutual understanding rather than reconciliation. They finally saw how their favoritism and neglect had shaped my childhood and driven me away. I finally understood that their behavior had been more about their own limitations and insecurities than any conscious decision to reject me. We were all flawed people who'd hurt each other in various ways, and acknowledging that was a first step toward building something healthier going forward. But the most important realization for me was that I didn't actually need their validation anymore. The successful business, the media recognition, the financial security, none of that had been about proving myself to them. It had been about proving to myself that I was capable of building a life worth living, regardless of where I'd started. As I was getting ready to leave that evening, Mom made one final gesture that surprised me. She asked if I'd be willing to join them for Thanksgiving dinner that year. Not as a family charity case or the prodigal son returning home, but as an equal member of the family with my own chair at the table. She said they'd been doing Thanksgiving wrong for years, focusing on appearances and tradition instead of gratitude and connection. I agreed, but with one condition. Instead of them hosting at their house, my house, technically, we'd celebrate at a restaurant where no one had to worry about seating arrangements or family hierarchy. Neutral territory where we could focus on being present with each other rather than recreating old patterns in familiar spaces. That Thanksgiving dinner was awkward but genuine. We talked about safe topics, mostly my business expansion plans, Jenny's nursing program, Sam's new job at a local construction company. But there were moments of real connection, too. Glimpses of what our family might have been like if we'd all been better at seeing each other as individuals rather than playing predetermined roles.